let's say, what was there before the promise of Phillips and
Guayama?
Guayama?
Uh-huh.
I can see that they didn't fulfill the promise, but let's say that Phillips never came.
Mhm.
What kind of economy was there?
Well, the economy was, I mean, if we go back to the 19th century, right, we said that the primary crop was coffee. And then after 1898, it was primarily sugar, right? The United States created this one crop, really, with culture and sugar plantations around coastal areas. And so in the interior, there wasn't really much. There's no work, really, right? So this is a problem. There wasn't really, and so that this was to help with this problem of unemployment and the fact that the only employment really available was the sugar industry. To bring other industries to Puerto Rico, they created all of these tax benefits, tax breaks for large companies to come, and bring factory jobs.
And no social responsibility as to, but you have to open schools or create community centers. Was there any such incentive?
There were schools. The United States did develop a public school system
Mm-hmm.
that was, at that time, the first half of the century, it was all English. It was really, and that changed mid to late century with the push for Spanish to be taught in the schools, and then Puerto Rico became bilingual. But before that, it was really all a push for all English, and they were U.S. public schools. So there were
Maybe
schools.
is it at the same time that bilingual education took hold here? Because I don't know when it began, really.
Bilingual education
Here.
in the U.S. Bilingual education has been in the U.S. for probably as long as the United States has been
Oh,
a
really?
country. Yeah, I mean, at first it was mostly German English. There were a lot of German English schools. And then around World War I, with the backlash against Germans, they closed the schools and said, it's the same thing that they're saying now, right? The same thing that they're saying now, that we need to unify the country. The country is too divided. We need to unify the country. So to unify the country, all Germans need to learn English. Everybody needs to learn English. And so it's the same thing, very similar to what's happening now with this push against bilingual education. So around the time of World War I, bilingual education was pretty much eliminated in the United States, and then there was a resurgence of it, and it was in the I want to say the early 70s. I can't remember the exact year now, but oh, Pedro's here. Maybe he can give us the exact year. The Lau versus Nichols case, was that 1974? Or was it before? 1950?
1972 or 73.
70, okay, so it was the early 70s.
Yeah, it was early
And
70s.
that was in California. It was the case in California
San Francisco.
with
Chinese
a
community.
Chinese student that the case ended up going to court and saying, and the argument was that children are entitled to an education that is equal to other students' education, basically that they should be able to understand. If they're not able to understand what's going on in the classroom, then they're not receiving an education that's equal to that of other children. So it started there, and then we'll move into talking more about that next week when we read about Antonia Pantoja.
Oh, did we have to read that for today? No?
It's for next week, right? For next week, we're gonna read a little bit about Pantoja and the development of bilingual education here. And that immediately followed the Lau versus Nickel case, right, in San Francisco.
Speed of consent decree
Mhm.
came afterwards.
So
But
we'll,
the interesting thing I was gonna say about that Lau decision is that was, the Supreme Court ruled on the basis of individual right,
mhm,
equal access clause of the Constitution, there's no recognition of group rights or cultural rights or anything like that. In other words,
Right.
Puerto Ricans as American citizens have the right to their language and culture to be maintained, or in this case Chinese or Native. It's still only based on an individual equal access clause.
Right.
So if you're giving a service, it has to be equally given to everybody, and if so somebody can't get it because then you have to provide, and that was the
Right.
rationale.
And the provision doesn't necessarily have to be bilingual
Right, right.
education the way that we know it.
Exactly,
Right.
and then they used to have what they call allow remedies,
Right.
and there was like gradations from full, what do you call it?
Immersion?
Full bilingual, what they
Dual
call
language,
now, dual language,
Mhm.
all the way to, just, English,
ESL,
pull out type of stuff, yeah. And depending on how many students you have in the school, how many in the class, this.
Mhm.
But then when the
Similar.
Reagan administration came in, they got rid of those our guidelines.
Mhm.
For special education, again, I forget the date, but the idea, it's called, the law that was
Mhm.
passed, that all students or kids are deserving of, I forget the exact wording, but the best possible education, fair, of course, with special education, you do have very specific needs, but
Mhm.
it was going towards inclusion and not to have them so secluded. So I think most of this country functions on individual needs. I'm not surprised to hear you say it
Right.
wasn't the group, but
Right.
the individual.
Yeah, group rights are not recognized.
Yeah.